Welcome back. In this video, we're going to be studying together Daniel 1 verse 8. Let's see if we can go to the text and see what it says. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. So in our previous videos, we'd have seen that Daniel's been brought to Babylon and he's in a very challenging situation that really would have been very challenging to his faith and really toxic to the practice of his religion and his faith in Yahweh. But we're told, but Daniel resolves to be faithful to Yahweh. That but is in contrast to all that the Babylonians were doing to shape him on the outside into the image of Babylon. And it tells us that whereas they were doing all this on the outside, on the inside, Daniel decided that he was not going to allow himself to be defiled. And he chooses as his battlefield the question of what he would eat. Now notice that he's not obnoxious in refusing to compromise. We're told that he having resolved that he would not defile himself, he asks the chief of the eunuchs to allow him to not defile himself. I think that's important because sometimes we can want to practice our faith in a way that draws attention to itself or that is obnoxious or unnecessarily combative. But that is not Daniel's approach. He actually takes a humble but a very strong approach in seeking to resist the attempt by the Babylonians to have him eat something that he would consider as defiling his conscience. Now, it's not clear what was defiling about the food. The word in Hebrew is patbag, and it would have referred to the food or provisions that he would have received. But there are a number of possibilities about as to what about the food Daniel would have considered to be defiling. It could be that the food was not kosher, meaning it infringed Jewish dietary laws by either involving unclean animals in breach of Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14. We know, for instance, that pork or horse meat was actually eaten in Babylon. Or perhaps it was just not prepared in accordance with Jewish law, such as by draining the blood, as required by Leviticus 17, 13 to 14, or perhaps by not mixing meat with milk. But if that was the case, one question would arise as to why Daniel insisted on water and not wine, because wine would not have been something that would have infringed the Jewish dietary laws. Also, in Daniel 10:3, Daniel is eating meat, delicacies, and drinking wine, which suggests that the vegetable and water diet was for a limited time, perhaps only during the 3 years that he was being trained. Another possibility is that the meat may have been sacrificed to or dedicated to pagan gods before being brought to the king's table. But it's likely that all food would have been offered or dedicated to the pagan gods first before delivered to the king's table, including the vegetables and the wines. Yet another possibility is that eating from the king's table would somehow have involved some loyalty to the king, which Daniel would have wanted to avoid. I think, however, that when you look at the context of the story, the food was what Nebuchadnezzar was using to nourish the young men so that they looked good in his court, in the same way that he was using the Babylonian literature and education to give them wisdom. See, the appearance of Daniel and his friends and the other trainees was important to to Nebuchadnezzar. Recall Daniel 1:2, Nebuchadnezzar wants the young men to be of good appearance without any physical defects to serve at his court. And we will see from verses 9 to 10 that the chief official, Ashpenaz, he refuses to change their diet because he's concerned about their appearance before the king. Also, at the end of the story, we're told that from eating vegetables and water instead of the king's food, Daniel and his friends looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. That's verse 15. And so I think we can assume that since at the end of the 3 years they were judged far superior to their peers, that this diet of vegetables and water continued for the 3 years of their training. It seems that Nebuchadnezzar was seeking to use the food from his table to nourish the young men and to give them a good appearance in the same way that he was seeking to use the literature and education of Babylon to give them wisdom, as he sought to have young men with good physical appearance and intellectual ability serve at his court. We will see in chapter 2 that Daniel's wisdom comes not from what the king provided, but from what God alone could give. And so I think the point is that Daniel not eating the king's food provides an opportunity to demonstrate that it is Yahweh that provides for him to be nourished and healthy looking and not the king. Daniel is eating from Yahweh's table and not the king's table, and his loyalty is to Yahweh and not to the king. Ultimately, Daniel's decision not to defile himself with the food from the king's table was a decision to be loyal to his covenant with Yahweh. Israel's food laws were intended to separate them from the Gentiles or the nations as God's holy people, and compromise in this area would have been a form of disloyalty to the covenant with Yahweh. Well, Joyce Baldwin offers another loyalty consideration which could have been at play in Daniel's decision not to eat the king's food. And she says, the book itself provides a needed clue in Daniel 11:26, where the rare word patbag, I told you earlier that that's a word that's translated food, it recurs at Daniel 11:26. And there, we're told that even those who eat his rich food, one of the kings who are in contest with each other, shall be his undoing. She goes on to say that by Eastern standards, to share a meal was to commit oneself to friendship. It was of covenant significance. Those who had thus committed themselves allegiance accepted an obligation of loyalty to the king. It would seem that Daniel rejected this symbol of dependence on the king because he wished to be free to fulfill his primary obligations to the God he served. The defilement he feared was not so much a ritual as a moral defilement, arising from the subtle flattery of gifts and favors, which entailed hidden implications of loyal support, however dubious the king's future policies might prove to be. Well, Aubrey Buster and John Walton suggest that in addition to cultic pollution, the Hebrew word translated defile in Daniel 1:8, Gaal, can symbolically refer to the defilement of guilty leaders whose hands have been stained with the blood of their victims. And so Nebuchadnezzar's food was defiled because his hands had been stained by his actions against the temple in Jerusalem, and Daniel's refusal resists not only loyalty in eating from his table, but resists association with his action against Yahweh's temple and Jerusalem. However we take it, Daniel refuses to eat the food because he believed in some way it would compromise the relationship with Yahweh, and he was determined to remain faithful despite the toxic circumstances that he faced in Babylon. I think it's important for us to consider all the different ways in which he could have been tempted to compromise. He had lots of reasons to compromise. For example, refusing could be seen as an insult to the king and as disobedience to the king's orders. You could think of the peer pressure that he was under. Everyone else was doing it, and perhaps he didn't want to stand out. The unorthodox behavior of refusing the food could have jeopardized his and his friends' chances to advance as members of the king's court. The quality of food would have been attractive. It would have been the best in the land. And they're far away from home, over 900 miles, and their family and friends would not know whether or not they kept God's laws. They were, in that sense, anonymous. And since God had not protected them from captivity, they could have been bitter, and they could have been, in their minds, feeling like they were not obliged to keep his commandments. Well, we can also be tempted today to compromise and to defile ourselves in the face of the pressures from the world. What does this look like today? Well, Jesus tells us that in the new covenant, we don't defile ourselves by what we eat. He says it is what comes out of a person that defiles him. For from within, out of the heart of man, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within, and they are what defile a person. So it's not food that defiles us under the new covenant, but the ways in which we are unfaithful to our covenant with Yahweh by loving the world more than Him and following its ways. Like Daniel, our circumstances in this world exert pressure on us to compromise and be unfaithful to God. We think, I need to provide materially for myself and my family, and the world says, in the environment in which we live, you can't provide for yourself and your family unless you compromise on your convictions about honesty and integrity. Well, we could multiply the examples of this kind of thinking. But becoming like what we're seeing instead of shining our light and being great examples is how we compromise and we defile ourselves. We've got to decide, like Daniel, to stand out and to not go the way that everyone else is going. See, faced with his own circumstances in which he was challenged in his faith and pressured to compromise, Daniel resolved not to defile himself. In our next video, we'll study Daniel 1 verses 9 to 16, and we will see what happens next. Hope you'll join us then.